At 59, Troy Aikman remains an icon that America can never forget. From a little boy who once had to wear casts to correct his crippled legs, he rose to become one of the greatest quarterbacks in NFL history, a man who led the Dallas Cowboys into the dazzling golden era of the 1990s. 3 Super Bowl championships, 6 Pro Bowl selections, Super Bowl MVP, Hall of Fame class of 2006. Those achievements didn't just write his name into history, they etched it deep into the hearts of millions of fans. With ice-cold composure and a genius for reading the game, Aikman turned the Cowboys into the symbol of American football, the standard for every quarterback who came after him. On the field, he never needed to shout or showboat. He led with his eyes, with throws sharp as a blade, with a steadiness that made the whole team believe victory was inevitable. Americans remember him through those explosive Super Bowl nights under the lights, through the roar of Texas Stadium when number 8 stepped onto the turf, an image of power, coolness, and invincibility. But behind all that glory lies a painful truth that not everyone has the courage to face. At 59, every morning for Troy begins with a back pain that cuts like a knife, the lasting aftermath of thousands of hits he took to bring America its glory. Some days he looks in the mirror and sees his hand tremble slightly, a brutal reminder that concussions never truly go away. On many quiet nights when the world is asleep, Troy still jolts awake from the ringing in his head, the sound the NFL left him with forever. Fans remember him through nights of triumph, but Troy remembers the NFL through the terrifying moments when he couldn't recall which game he'd played, how many passes he'd thrown, or how he even left the field. "America once loved me, and I gave it more than my body could handle," he once said. That wasn't a complaint, it was the truth of a man who traded his youth, his health, his memory, and his private life to become a legend. And it's in the broken pieces of that pain that Troy's will shines brightest. No whining, no collapsing, just quietly moving forward, as if true greatness lies in keeping getting back up, long after the stadium lights have gone out. If you want to continue the journey into the untold dark corners of Troy Aikman's life, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Even after the NFL's spotlight faded behind him, leaving scars on his body that time can't erase, few know that the painful journey actually began before he could even walk. Because Troy Aikman did not come into this world with a perfect body, he was born with both legs in casts, wrapped tight from heel to knee, as if fate wanted to test him from his very first breath. The image of a newborn lying still beneath layers of white plaster, legs unable to move, became the harsh opening chapter of a life that would forever be tied to pain and endurance. At 6 months old, Troy still couldn't stand or kick like other babies. Every time his mother lifted him and gently rotated his tiny legs the way the doctors instructed, she saw the corners of his mouth tighten in pain. Not loud crying, but the kind of small heartbreaking sound, a groan from a baby who didn't yet know words but already knew how to suffer. The doctor told the family a sentence cold as a knife: "This boy may never play sports." For most children, that's just a medical opinion. For Troy, that prophecy became a shadow that followed him his whole life, a forecast of the endless war between his will and his body. His mother, a patient and loving woman, tried to hide her fear with smiles in front of her son. But at night, when the house was quiet, she sat by the crib staring at Troy's tiny legs locked in braces, wondering if her boy would have to live his whole life with limits he didn't choose. His father, a man of few words, chose silence. That silence wasn't indifference. It was not knowing how to face the disappointment properly. It was the heavy kind of silence every family member felt, a sadness no one dared speak aloud, afraid that saying it would make it true forever. Troy's early years were an endless cycle of hospitals, therapy rooms, and pitying looks from adults. People saw a flawed child, a fragile body few believed could ever run, kick a ball, or join normal games. But there was one thing they didn't see, or couldn't see: the quiet stubbornness being forged inside that little boy. When his legs couldn't hold him up, his mind started learning how to stand firm against life. The memories his family still tell about young Troy aren't of a kid who cried a lot, but of a boy who clenched his teeth. The kind of clenched teeth only people who've known long pain understand. No screaming, no fighting back, just enduring in silence. as if his young soul already knew this wasn't temporary pain, but a lifelong test. When Troy was 2, the casts finally came off, but instead of freedom, he had to wear heavy orthopedic shoes connected by a metal bar, every step dragging a symbolic chain of the limits life had locked onto him. The rare childhood photos that remain show Troy standing in the yard, legs spread wide, shoes held fixed by the bar. That wasn't the stance of a kid about to run. It was the stance of a kid learning to conquer what his body said he couldn't. Anyone else might have crumbled. Not Troy. In his first look at the world, a painful truth already existed that later became his strength. Nobody was coming to save him. No doctor could promise he'd run. No parent could swap his weak body for a new one. No pitying glance could turn hardship into opportunity. If he wanted to walk like other kids, he had to walk himself. If he wanted a life bigger than casts on his legs, he had to break the casts himself. The mindset of "I have to be stronger than my body" started right there, not on a football field, not in Super Bowls, not from legendary throws, but from the days Troy tried to lift a leg that wouldn't cooperate. That was the moment that shaped the destiny of a man America would later call unbreakable, steadfast, fearless. Few realize that before facing hundreds of thunderous hits from NFL linebackers, before accepting the risk of losing his memory to concussions, Troy had already trained himself to face pain when he wasn't even tall enough to see over the kitchen table. And that earliest adversity, carved quietly like a mark into stone, prepared him for a future where the reward was glory, but the price was his own body. While other kids learned to run, Troy learned to endure pain. While they learned to throw a ball, Troy learned to get up after falling. And while they dreamed of becoming players, Troy only had one brutally simple dream: to walk freely on his own 2 feet. No one imagined that small dream would become the foundation for him to go farther than anyone dared imagine, to massive stadiums, carrying the hopes of an entire city on his shoulders, and becoming a legend America can't replace. But to truly understand how deep that glory runs, we have to remember that every bit of Troy's brilliance started with a painful truth. He never had a perfect body, but he had a will so strong it forced his body to submit. And that's the seed of both the tragedy and the greatness in his life, a life that began in casts, yet moved forward with a spirit nothing could break. Troy grew up with legs that were finally freer, but his soul never fully escaped the feeling of being different. And then, just when he was starting to adjust to life in California, fate pushed the Aikman family down another sharp turn: a move to Henrietta, Oklahoma, a town too small for big dreams, where the night sky was quieter than the loneliness of a kid who'd only just learned to stand steady. For most families, moving is just a change of address. For a boy like Troy, who'd already spent half his childhood fighting his own body, it meant starting over from zero. His first day at school in Oklahoma, Troy had no friends, no one who recognized him, no familiar faces that once looked at him with sympathy. In the new place, sympathy turned to indifference. The California kid became the new kid, and in small towns, the new kid usually means the odd one out. The local children had grown up together since diapers, played on the same fields, went to fall festivals with generations of family. Troy stood outside that circle. Every recess, he didn't know where to stand, eyes scanning the playground for something to hold on to, someone to smile at him. But the wait always ended in empty air. That isolation, whether intentional or not, cut deep into the heart of a child trying to find his worth. Oklahoma was harsh in a quiet way. Summer sun beat down on red dust roads, winter wind howled across empty yards. No tall buildings, no busy streets, no crowds to make a boy feel small yet still part of a bigger world. Here, loneliness couldn't hide. It was everywhere, from the vast cloudless sky to the echo of his own footsteps on empty sidewalks. And then came football, not as some grand dream, not as a glamorous escape. Football came to Troy at the exact moment he needed something, anything, to make him feel seen. At first it was just a game the other kids dragged him into, a scuffed leather ball tossed back and forth on a dusty field behind the school. But for Troy, that ball weighed more than any other kid felt. It carried the hope of being noticed, of being valued, of hearing someone call his name without pity. And slowly, football became the only place that boy felt he existed. Not because he was instantly great, he wasn't. But every time the ball left his hand and flew through the air, Troy felt lighter, as if he were throwing his fear of being worthless far away. He never told anyone, but football was how he spoke to a sadness he couldn't share. Evenings in Oklahoma were colder than Troy remembered. After dinner, when the house lights dimmed, he would quietly take the ball to the backyard where weeds mixed with red dirt. The night was pitch black, wind whistling through old trees, and the boy stood there alone, throwing the ball into the silent dark. No cheers, no teammates, no coach, just the wind, the slap of the ball against his hands, and the sigh of a kid trying to outrun the thought, "I'm not good enough." Those throws had no target. They were survival throws, throws to push back the feeling of being unimportant, throws to prove he was here, on this strange land. Under Oklahoma's endless sky, Troy learned something he wouldn't fully understand until years later. Sometimes to become anything at all, a person first has to learn to survive loneliness. Those nights taught Troy what Super Bowls never would, what titles never mention, what glory never talks about. Greatness doesn't come from outside cheers, but from the choked sob inside a child who refuses to let the world forget him. And right there on that lonely patch of ground, on those evenings throwing into silence, Troy Aikman took his first slow, solitary, determined steps on a path that would lead to a destiny no one could have predicted. As the lonely Oklahoma nights slowly forged an iron spirit inside the boy Troy, a bigger dream began to form in a heart no one in that small town could see. With a throwing arm that grew sharper by the day, Troy became a high school phenomenon at Henrietta. And then what he had only dared imagine on those nights throwing into the void finally became real. A scholarship from the University of Oklahoma. For a boy born with legs in casts, being welcomed by OU, one of America's elite football programs, was practically a miracle. The day he arrived in Norman, Troy carried a fierce belief that this would be where he became a historic quarterback, where his childhood dream would finally bloom into reality. But like every turning point in his life, that hope didn't stand long against fate. OU at the time was famous for its run-heavy system, a machine that crushed opponents but also crushed the role of a pass-first quarterback like Troy. He was like a pianist dropped into an orchestra that only played drums. He knew he had talent, but no one would let him show it. In early practices, Troy tried to hide his disappointment. He wanted to believe that effort and grit would change everything. But day after day, Troy barely threw. He handed off, ran plays, and watched a run-first system work perfectly without ever needing someone like him. The role he had dreamed of since childhood, the leader, the one who shaped the game, became just a shadow. And then the real blow came. During one fateful practice, as Troy spun to throw, a hit from the OU defense twisted his ankle at a sickening angle. The first sensation wasn't pain. It was the cold, unmistakable crack inside the bone. Then the pain exploded like fire up his leg, dropping him to the turf. Lying on the grass, Troy couldn't move. The deep green OU field, the huge Oklahoma sky, teammates running past, everything blurred into a mocking scene. A stage of glory he might never stand in the spot he wanted. The team doctor was blunt. "You're out long term. If you're not careful, this ankle will never be the same." To most people, that's just medical news. To Troy, it was a death sentence. The dream he carried from his Oklahoma backyard to the OU locker room now lay still under white bandages, swollen purple and burning. Worse, in OU's run-first system, an injured quarterback was little more than a broken tool. No one said it out loud, but the looks from coaches, teammates, and people in the hallway all carried the same silent question: do we really need him? A kid who had spent his childhood terrified he wasn't good enough, who had always fought to prove his body didn't define his worth, now fell straight into his deepest nightmare, being discarded. Troy tried to rehab. He forced himself to stand on the half-healed ankle, limping through runs, clinging to the thin hope that OU would eventually need him. But every week the team won without him. Every game was proof the system didn't need a passer like him. And when his body wouldn't heal fast enough, Troy faced the truth many young athletes refuse to accept. Sometimes the problem isn't talent, it's an environment that refuses to give you a chance. The decision to leave OU for UCLA wasn't easy. It was a knife to the pride he had spent his whole life protecting. When the news broke, the backlash was instant. People called Troy a quitter, not tough enough, not real Oklahoma football. On fan forums the mockery poured in. If he was that good he would have stayed. What kind of QB throws when nobody wants it? Let him go, who cares? And those words, even though no one said them to his face, tore apart every piece of self-worth he had tried to build. The night before leaving Troy sat alone in his tiny dorm room. The weak yellow desk lamp shone on his still swollen, roughly bandaged ankle. Wind through the window carried distant cheers from practice, the sounds he once believed he would be the center of. Troy bowed his head, gently tapped the ankle, feeling the throb match his heartbeat. That tap was like the question he didn't dare ask aloud. Does everything I believed in even matter? In that moment he wasn't a future legend or Hall of Fame QB. He was just a young man hit way too hard, way too soon by life. And then, like the instinct of someone who had learned to stand up alone since childhood, he took a deep breath, looked at his shoes, and made the decision that would change his life forever. If this place was suffocating his dream, he would find a place where it could breathe. But that night, in the empty room, before stepping toward UCLA, Troy Aikman was just a young soul sitting among the shards of his first broken dream, a dream crushed under fate's boot, and the indifference of people who never understood the loneliness of a quarterback not allowed to be wrong. Leaving Troy Aikman carried baggage few could see: an ankle that wasn't healed, a reputation in tatters, and a deep crack in his self-worth that time would never easily mend. When he arrived at UCLA, it wasn't just a new start, it was an escape. Escape from OU's shadow, from the mockery, from the feeling he had been wrongly defined by a system not built for him. But deep down, he was also running from the most shameful fear an athlete can carry: the fear of failing again. At UCLA, the football system was completely different. This was quarterback heaven, where the ball flew more than it was run, where intelligence and accuracy were celebrated, where Troy could finally do what he was born to do. From the very first practices his talent exploded so brightly that UCLA coaches admitted, "We just picked up a diamond Oklahoma never learned how to polish." Success came fast, like cool wind after a brutal summer. In his first start, Troy threw passes sharp as knives, controlling games with a calm most college players never have. UCLA started winning, and the name Aikman began appearing in California papers, not as a quitter, but as a gifted quarterback reborn. But that was the surface. Underneath, Troy still carried a smoldering wound. Every time the crowd roared after a perfect throw, he heard another sound: the doubt from OU, the laughter of people who once saw him as extra. And every post-game interview, even when he only heard praise, his mind quietly asked, are they praising my talent, or the fact I walked away from what broke me? Success at UCLA wasn't liberation. It was proof he was finally in the right place. But it was also a reminder that if he slipped again, if another injury hit, if one wrong decision dropped him, everything would flood back. He could be drowned forever. Every win, instead of pure joy, became another demand. You're not allowed to fail. Perfection became a burden. The ghost of OU followed him on every throw. In every practice he felt invisible eyes from the past staring, ready to pull him down the moment he stumbled. Some nights, after long practices and tense film sessions, he drove alone down Sunset Boulevard, golden lights stretching ahead. But no matter how big the city, he still felt as lonely as the nights throwing into the Oklahoma dark. That loneliness no longer came from having no one beside him. It came from knowing he was fighting an opponent no one else could see, the fear he wasn't good enough. And the greatest fear, the one that haunted him for years, was the simple brutal question: what if I get hurt again? The ankle still ached when he planted hard. Some days it swelled a little, reminding him of OU. Some days it stabbed, threatening his future. Every time he went down on the field, his heart skipped, as if his body whispered, is this the last time? But that very fear made him throw harder, decide faster, play with an urgency, as if every game were his last. People watched Troy and marveled at his calm, but few knew it wasn't confidence. It was armor forged from the terror of losing everything again. And then, at UCLA, Troy did what he had always done his whole life. He turned pain into fuel. He turned the string of humiliations at OU into the strongest mental fire he ever had. He didn't play to prove UCLA right for believing in him. He played to prove OU wrong for giving up on him. Every perfect throw was defiance. Every win was a knife in old stereotypes. And when UCLA climbed toward the top of the Pac-10, when fans called him the school's new hope, Troy Aikman stood in the middle of the Rose Bowl, looked up at tens of thousands cheering, and in that moment he knew he had survived. But survival didn't mean healing, because even as a star, Troy still heard OU whispering in the dark, "You'll fall again." Success at UCLA therefore carried a quiet sadness. It was like beautiful sunshine through a window after a huge storm, warm but still echoing with thunder in the mind. Troy Aikman was reborn at UCLA, yes, but he was reborn with a heart that still carried OU's crack, a crack that never disappeared, only waited silently for the chance to hurt again. And then as his throws started catching the eyes of NFL scouts, a new path opened before Troy, a path that would make him a legend, but also a path where the wounds from OU would return, heavier, crueler, and demand a price he never saw coming. From UCLA, Troy Aikman's path led straight to the NFL, the promised land every young quarterback dreams of, and the place where countless dreams are crushed without mercy. When his name was called first in the 1989 NFL Draft, the whole world saw him as the symbol of a new hope. Draft #1 overall, the rookie expected to lead a legendary franchise that had once ruled the league. That should have been the most beautiful moment of his life, the moment every kid who ever threw a ball into the darkness dreams about. But Troy was sent to the Dallas Cowboys at the darkest point in franchise history, a fallen empire, a broken locker room, a roster so weak analysts called that year's Dallas team, a ship with no rudder, and the 22-year-old rookie, #1 pick, carrying the expectations of an entire massive city, had to become that rudder himself. What no one told Troy was this: a man who had only just learned to stand up from the pain of his past could not save a team that was already sinking. Troy Aikman's 1989 rookie season became one of the most brutal any quarterback has ever endured. The Cowboys finished 1-15, the worst record in the league. But statistics can't tell the full extent of the destruction. Troy was sacked over and over, hit by defensive linemen weighing hundreds of pounds who crashed into him like sledgehammers. Some of those hits left him unsure which stadium he was in, what quarter it was, or even who they were playing. Fans saw him get up after every blow, face cold as stone, but inside there was stabbing pain shooting from neck to back, a heart pounding out of rhythm from the shock, fingers going numb. On the field he looked like a warrior. In his mind he was just a young man trying to survive a wave of disappointment from an entire city. He had come here to be reborn, to prove he was bigger than the wounds from OU. Instead, his first days in the NFL pushed him deeper into an abyss than any pain he had ever known. Every night after games, Troy came home to a small apartment, body so bruised that hot shower water felt like needles. He stood under the spray trying to loosen his muscles, but sometimes only minutes in he realized the hot water wasn't the only thing running down his skin. It was mixing with tears he couldn't hold back. Not from physical pain, he had known pain since childhood, but from a suffocating helplessness. Why can't I save them? Why do I throw well and the team still loses? Do I really belong in the NFL? In the dark he heard the old OU mockery echoing again, as if fate was telling him he was only good when he wasn't truly tested. But the NFL is the ultimate test, and it started grinding Troy down, piece by piece. Then came the moment he would never forget for the rest of his life, the hit from Chris Dolman, defensive end of the Minnesota Vikings. The Metrodome that night was colder than usual. The wind whistling through the dome sounded like a warning for a hopelessly uneven fight. On what looked like a routine play, Troy spun to throw and Dolman hit him with speed and power beyond anything he was ready for. It all happened in a fraction of a second. Green turf became sky, sky became blackness, then ground. The impact was so violent Troy felt his brain jerk hard to one side. Crowd noise faded. Referee whistles sounded distant. His own voice disappeared completely. Troy lay motionless. Everything was so quiet he could hear the wind scraping across the stands, a sharp cold sound like metal clawing at his heart. He tried to move a finger and couldn't. His neck felt locked by an invisible hand, and in that moment Troy truly believed his career was over. When medical staff rushed the field, put on a neck brace and lifted him onto the stretcher, Troy didn't see the crowd or his teammates. He only saw darkness and a question soaked in despair: will I ever get up again? After that hit, everything changed. The NFL was no longer a boyhood dream, it became a battlefield, literally. A place where broken bones, torn ligaments and rattled brains weren't accidents, they were the mandatory price of admission. I started to understand, Troy said years later. The NFL isn't a game, it's war. The following weeks he still took the field, still absorbed terrifying hits, still tried to look strong for the cameras, even though every turn of his neck sent electric pain down his spine. Dallas saw a brave young quarterback. They didn't see the silent fear eating him alive. How many more hits until I never get up? At 22, Troy wasn't just tasked with resurrecting the Cowboys, he had to resurrect himself from the ruins of OU, from the terror of concussions, from absolute loneliness in a league crueler than anyone could imagine. But the cruelest thing about the NFL is this: no matter how much you hurt, how scared you are, how broken you feel, it keeps going. Next week, next month, next season. No one pauses so you can catch your breath. No one cares about the OU ankle that once made you cry in a dorm room. No one sees the legs once wrapped in casts the day you were born. You either stand up, or you get replaced. And in that brutality, Troy slowly realized life had given him no other choice but to fight. Yet no one knew that when night fell, and Dallas slept, a young quarterback sat motionless in his living room, hands clutching his head, trying to stop the ringing inside his skull, the aftermath of dozens of hits fans casually call part of the game. He was the #1 pick. But being the #1 pick didn't make him immune to fear, didn't save him from pain, didn't shield him from the brutal truth he lived every week. From the peak of hope, Troy fell straight into the depths of reality. But it was right there among defeat, injury and hits that left him unable to remember entire games, that Troy's warrior spirit began to form. Not the spirit to win, the spirit to survive. Because in the NFL, only those who can get up after being destroyed ever have a chance to become legends. And Troy, though he didn't know it yet, was stepping into the most painful and greatest journey of his life. After the dark one, 15 season, no one could have guessed that from those ruins would rise the greatest football dynasty of the 1990s, under the hand of Jimmy Johnson and the Holy Trinity, later known as the Triplets: Troy Aikman, Emmitt Smith, Michael Irvin. People speak of the triplets as the symbol of power, speed and perfect precision. Few understand that to create that blazing glory, one man paid more than anyone else: Troy Aikman, the ice-cold brain behind the empire. While Emmitt tore up the turf and Irvin leapt for impossible catches, while fans screamed over victories, Troy remained the calm eye of the storm, quiet, steadfast and accurate to an almost inhuman degree. Under Jimmy Johnson, the Cowboys became a perfectly engineered winning machine: Irvin the fire, Emmitt the heart, Troy the steady heartbeat, the cool head that made the whole team run like a deadly symphony. His throws weren't wild gunslinger heaves, they were programmed arrows that landed exactly where and when they were supposed to. People praised him as a handsome, cold-blooded general who never let emotion cloud his decisions. What they never saw was the trembling behind locker room doors, the mornings he had to brace his hands against the wall just to stand straight, the amount of painkillers he swallowed to throw one more game. For Troy, every game wasn't just a dazzling performance, it was a negotiation with the pain in his own body. Anyone can be a quarterback when they're not getting hit. To become a legend in the NFL, you have to keep standing when your body has been ground down, until you can't feel anything anymore. And that's what Troy did better than anyone. Before every game, the ritual was the same. Trainers peeled off layers of tape, packed ice on swollen red spots, checked fingers already stiffened from too many helmet collisions. Then came the worst part: the needles. Doctors injected pain-numbing shots into wrists, shoulders, back, places bruised black from brutal sacks. Troy rarely winced, but every time the needle went in he clenched his jaw as if swallowing a mountain. That wasn't bravery. That was necessity. The NFL waits for no one. The Cowboys were becoming an empire, and an empire cannot stop for one man's pain. But how much pain can be ignored forever? Troy's body slowly turned into a battlefield of bruises, cracked bones, and headaches no one could cure. After one game against the 49ers he stood in the shower, water running over screaming shoulders, spine to hip feeling like pins and needles. He touched his scalp and felt it still numb from the final hit. The world called Troy cool, a born leader, but they didn't know there were showers where tears mixed with the hot water, not because they lost, but because the pain was so total he couldn't tell water from sweat from the despair inside him. The more the Cowboys won, the brighter the glory, the more his body was crushed. 3 Super Bowls in 4 years weren't magic, they were the result of a trio playing like tomorrow didn't exist. But for Troy alone the road to those titles was paved with post-game dizziness, ringing ears at night, patches of purple skin he had to hide under jerseys, and the iron will forged from childhood casts. Jimmy Johnson once said, "Troy is the only person I've ever known who could get hit so hard he could barely stand, and minutes later read a defense like nothing happened." That was praise, but also proof of the brutality he endured. In every drop back, 3 steps, 5 steps, 7 steps, Troy wasn't just facing the defense, he was facing echoes from OU, the fear of being discarded if he failed, facing childhood trauma. How much more would this body betray him? Facing the NFL's harsh truth, you have no right to be weak, no right to be slow, no right to be afraid. 1 second of hesitation, and one hit can end you forever. One of the most haunting images of his career came in a playoff game against the Vikings. In the Metrodome, where cold wind cut like steel through every layer, Troy was driven hard into the turf by Chris Dolman again. The collision sounded like a hammer on metal, and once more Troy lay motionless, no twitch, no reaction, just a body still on the frozen artificial grass. When he opened his eyes the stadium lights blurred. The ball lay a few yards away. The only thing he heard was the wind across the dome, the same wind that would later haunt his worst nightmares. He survived, of course, but a part of him never came back from that hit. A piece of the belief that his body could endure forever cracked. Yet in the paradox of sport, the most painful moments are often the ones that forge legends. Troy returned the next game, not because he wasn't hurting, because the Empire needed him. And he did the only thing he had ever known since he was a child in casts: get up and keep fighting. The glory of the Triplets-era Cowboys blazed like light at the horizon, powerful, blinding, seemingly eternal. But the brighter the light, the longer the shadow behind it. And the darkness in Troy's life was the constant gnawing pain that followed him every day, every hour, every game. When the Cowboys hoisted the Lombardi Trophy and fans cried with joy, no one knew that night Troy slept sitting up because lying down hurt his back too much. No one knew he needed an hour of ice massage just to walk in the victory parade the next day. No one knew that before the 3rd Super Bowl started, he vomited in the locker room because the headache was so bad, the fluorescent lights made him reel. To the world, Troy Aikman was the emotionless face of victory. To himself, he was a man carrying countless wounds he was never allowed to show. And in those moments on the victory podium, with confetti flying and cheers crashing into his ears, Troy understood something few athletes dare say out loud. This empire was built with flesh and bone, and most of it was mine. But he accepted it, because that was the price of immortality. And Troy Aikman, with all his physical and mental pain, paid it in full. The Cowboys' empire kept growing, victories stretched on like destiny, and people believed Troy Aikman was the perfect machine, unbreakable, unshatterable, never stepping back from any hit. But it was during those very glory years that his body began sending signals the world of that era didn't understand, or worse, deliberately ignored. The 1990s NFL was ruthless. Concussions were dismissed as getting your bell rung, players were taught to get up even when the world spun wildly around them. And for Troy, those hits began piling up, layering on top of each other like invisible hammer blows to his brain every game. The first time Troy felt something wrong wasn't from a massive sack, but from what seemed like a routine collision. He vaguely remembers the moment his head hit the ground. His vision suddenly went black, ears rang like wind screaming through a crack, and a cold silence wrapped around his entire consciousness. When teammates pulled him up, his legs wouldn't obey. Sounds around him were distorted, like a radio full of static. For several seconds he didn't know who he was or what city he was in. On the sideline, the team doctor just shone a light in his eyes and asked a few simple questions. Troy answered two correctly, stared blankly at the third, but back then that was enough. "You're fine," the doctor said. And Troy, who saw collapsing as the ultimate sin, nodded and walked back onto the field. The truth was he wasn't fine, and he wouldn't be fine for many years after. Those headshots didn't heal, they just slept, then woke up when the next one landed. In games after that, every time he was driven into the ground, it felt like his skull was being slammed against concrete. The instant his head hit the turf, the world flashed from green to white to black. Flashes of light stabbed his eyes. He stood up, trying to hide his shaking legs, then jogged back to the huddle like nothing happened. Emmitt Smith once said, "There were times I saw Troy look at us with eyes that didn't recognize anybody, but he still threw the ball with freakish accuracy." That accuracy didn't come from being okay, it came from clinging to whatever scraps of consciousness he had left. There's a famous game where, after being pulled off the field, Troy looked the doctor dead in the eye and asked a question that still chills people. Did we win or lose? The Cowboys were winning. He had already thrown 2 touchdown passes, but in that moment all of it had been erased from his mind like dust blown off a mountain. For a quarterback, memory is a weapon. For Troy, it slowly became something the hits stole piece by piece, but the NFL of that era didn't believe in brain damage. No MRIs, no strict protocols, no one mentioned CTE. If you could stand and weren't vomiting on the field, you played. And Troy, who had spent his childhood fighting his own body, never learned how to say no. He went back out with blurry vision, head pounding like lightning, ears still ringing. He read defenses in a state most people couldn't stand up in. He called long passes while pressure behind his forehead felt like someone driving nails into his skull. Jimmy Johnson, years later, summed it up in words fans still quote as proof of how brutal the era was. Troy played many games in conditions where today's doctors wouldn't let a player leave a dark room. But it was a different time, and that was Troy. After games when everyone else had driven away, Troy often sat alone in a pitch-black house. Every light off, only a faint glow from the hallway. Not because he liked darkness, because light made his head explode. He closed his eyes but couldn't sleep. The ringing in his ears pounded like waves on a shore, steady, relentless, torturous. Beneath that sound was the throb of his pulse in his brain, what he described as someone using a hammer inside my skull, over and over, beat after beat. He massaged his temples until the skin was raw. He iced his forehead, his neck. Nothing made the pain go away. Only around 3 or 4 a.m., when exhaustion finally forced shutdown, did he fall into shallow, restless sleep. And just a few hours later, the sun came up and he woke to prepare for the next practice, another day of playbook study, media, hiding pain the way people hide blemishes. Those hits didn't just take his health, they took pieces of his memory, games he only remembered the beginning and end of, post-game interviews he couldn't recall giving, days he drove to practice and arrived realizing he had no memory of the drive. The boy who once feared casts would keep him from ever running, was now facing a far greater terror. How far would his brain betray him? That was a question no one outside could see, because to the world Troy was the symbol of strength, the leader who never fell, the winner. But inside his head every hit was a reminder of fragility, that all his glory could vanish in one careless collision. He began to fear the moments when his head hit the turf, and he heard no explosion, because that meant the hit was so hard his brain didn't even register it. The silence inside his head was scarier than the ringing, because it signaled deeper damage. Team doctors back then only checked pupils, asked basic questions. What's your name? What day is it? Do you hurt? Troy always answered correctly, partly because he was more lucid than he looked, and partly because he knew one wrong answer and he'd be pulled from the game, and that to him was worse than pain. So he learned to hide. learned to smile while his vision blurred, learned to jog onto the field while his legs went numb, learned to talk to reporters while his head spun like a top, learned to live two parallel lives, one for America, one for himself, but the price of that endurance was the quiet collapse of his body. After each season, bruises turned permanent. Neck nerves became so sensitive a hard pat sent shooting pain. Some mornings he woke unable to feel two fingers. Some days he looked in the mirror and saw eyes that had lost their youthful light, and it all came from hits to the head. Hits TV viewers watched in slow motion and cheered, but for Troy they were pieces of himself lost forever. People said those hits made him tougher. No, they took something from him, something he could never get back. Those hits were, in a way, the quietest tragedy of his life, because they couldn't be seen, couldn't be bandaged, couldn't be stitched, couldn't be wrested away. They lived in his brain, his memory, his sleep, and Troy understood better than anyone. This was the price of immortality. No legend is exempt from. Fans saw him lift the Lombardi Trophy. Only Troy knew that to lift that trophy he had traded away part of his mind. And the greatest tragedy was, even after winning everything, he would never fully know how much he had lost. After years living with ringing ears, blinding light sensitivity, and moments of memory swallowed whole as if erased from time itself, Troy Aikman kept taking the field, as if the warrior spirit was so deep in his blood, he no longer knew any other way to live. But then came the year 2000, when the Cowboys were no longer an empire, and his body was too exhausted to keep hiding the accumulated damage. Fate chose to close the final chapter in the cruelest way possible. December 10, 2000. Opponent, Washington Redskins. Defining moment, LeVar Arrington. One hit that didn't just end a game, it ended an entire NFL life. Troy still remembers that play clearly, so clearly that years later the memory still sends chills down his spine. The Cowboys were on offense, and as he had thousands of times before, he dropped back 7 steps. He read the defense, set his feet, and the instant he began to release the ball, jersey number 56 exploded into him like an artillery shell. Arrington drove straight into Troy's chest and face with force that sounded like steel bending. His head snapped back violently, then slammed into the turf as if pulled by the gravity of the entire sky. His eyes went black instantly. A shrill screech filled his ears. A cold electric wave paralyzed his whole body down the spine. He didn't get up. This time the body refused. Before he had always forced himself up, even when he didn't know where he was. But this time his legs couldn't feel the ground. His arms didn't know where they were. And in the few seconds that felt like a lifetime, Troy understood what was happening. "I'm not a football player anymore." No one heard him say it, but it was the clearest sentence in his mind since his career began. Medical staff rushed in. They asked if he could hear them. He could, but everything sounded warped and underwater. They asked where it hurt. He couldn't answer. They put on a neck brace. They brought the cart. And as they lifted him, he looked up at a hazy sky he had stared at thousands of times after being knocked down. But this time the sky felt utterly foreign. No one knew this would be the last time Troy Aikman lay on an NFL field as a player, not even him. On the ride off the field his mind spun. Stands, teammates, stadium lights, all blurred together like a dream torn apart. He remembers Emmett bending over him, eyes full of worry. He remembers Irvin placing a hand on his shoulder in a silent goodbye. No one dared voice. But what Troy remembers most is the feeling in his chest, empty, heavy, and so painful it was hard to breathe, not from the hit, but because he knew he had reached the end of the road. In the medical room the doctor checked pupils, reflexes, asked Troy his name. He answered correctly, but it took a few seconds. That was the red flag. When the exam ended, the doctor looked at him with eyes Troy would never forget, the eyes of someone about to deliver life-altering news. "Troy, I have to be straight with you. One more hit like that, and you might never speak normally again." Those words stabbed his heart like an ice-cold knife. It wasn't a threat, it was a verdict. A life sentence his body had been trying to warn him about for years, but he had refused to hear. As the cart took him away he looked through the foggy window. Fans were still there, lights still blazed. The game went on as if his life hadn't just been ripped in half. He had thought he would play one more season, one more year, one more game, but now he understood it was over before he was ready. That night when Dallas fell silent, Troy came home. His shoulder hurt so badly he couldn't lift his arm. His head felt like a boulder was crushing it. He turned off every light and walked slowly to the living room. On the table sat his familiar silver helmet, the symbol of his whole life, his childhood dream, his pride and sacrifice. He sat down, stared at the helmet like a mirror reflecting himself, a man who had given everything for 3 Lombardi trophies and countless classic games, but also a man who had lost too much memories, health, years he could have lived without pain. He picked up the helmet and held it in his lap. His fingers trembled slightly as they traced the fresh gouge on the side, the mark from Arrington's hit, a signature of the end. Then he whispered, for no one but himself, "This thing took too much," not in anger, in the voice of a man who had finally understood the true price of glory. No tears, no outburst, just a gentle silence more painful than any scream. The silence of a man who knew the most important chapter of his life had closed, not in Super Bowl fireworks, not amid roaring crowds, but in the cruel quiet of a Texas winter night. The next day the Cowboys announced a severe concussion. No one said it was his last game ever, no one dared, and Troy still showed up to practice, still watched film, still wore the neck brace, as if it were just another fall, but deep down he knew. No quarterback plays when his brain is screaming for mercy, no legend is immortal against time, and no heart can withstand the accumulated toll of thousands of collisions. At the end of the season, Troy Aikman retired, just 1 year after Arrington's hit. No ceremony, no grand farewell speech, no stadium tribute, just a simple statement, true to who he was: "I've done everything I could." But only those closest to him knew the truth. He didn't leave because the passion was gone. He left to save whatever was left of himself before the NFL took the rest. And so at the very moment he touched football immortality and Cowboys history, his career died, not in Super Bowl fireworks, but under one cold, merciless hit from fate. And for Troy Aikman, that remains the saddest ending of a life given completely to the game. Retirement wasn't a decision. It was a fall. And when Troy Aikman officially walked out the NFL's door, the world he once belonged to suddenly felt foreign, as if it had never truly welcomed him. For 12 years he had lived inside the roar of crowds, under stadium lights, with adrenaline coursing through him every time the ball was snapped. Then, abruptly, all those sounds vanished, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like a giant shadow draped over the entire house. No more turf, no more teammates slapping his shoulder pads, no more practices that left sweat pouring onto the grass, no more helmet collisions that jolted him awake. And strangely, when everything that used to hurt him disappeared, he didn't feel relief, he felt empty. Other retired players say it's like starting over. For Troy it was like no longer being yourself, because for his entire adult life he had only known one language: football, only one place he belonged, the NFL. Now he had neither. In the first days away from the field, Troy began to feel himself disappearing. He would walk into the living room, look at the bookshelf, the TV, the helmet on the table, and realize he didn't know what to do next. Career, plans, goals, everything had once been dictated by the NFL, week by week, game by game, season by season. Now no one told him what to do, and that freedom didn't bring joy, it brought fear. He started feeling low. At first it was just heaviness in his shoulders, then morning exhaustion, then nights staring at the ceiling until 3 a.m., wondering what he was worth outside of jersey number 8. People call it mild depression, but for someone who had always tied his value to performance, to wins, to being the leader, there was no mild. It was a crack in the soul that widened every day. One night, when someone asked how it felt to leave the NFL, Troy forced a smile and said, "I'm fine." But when he got home he sat alone in the dark. No TV, no lights, just the ticking of the clock. And he understood that fine was just a word to stop people from asking more. When Fox offered him a broadcasting job, many thought it was salvation, a new career, a reason to get up every day. a way to stay connected to the sport that had defined his life. And indeed, on his first day on air, Troy wore a sharp suit, smiled at the camera, and broke down plays with the same sharp mind that had built his career. Viewers loved hearing him talk. Producers called him born for television. But that was the surface. Inside, Troy still felt like he was living in his own shadow. On the field he had control. On the field he wrote the story. On television he only narrated someone else's. From the broadcast booth looking down at the game, football no longer belonged to him. He was an outsider, watching, no longer deciding. Every time a young quarterback took a hard hit, he heard the familiar thud of helmet on turf, and the pain behind his own head came alive again, reminding him that place used to be his, and that it had taken everything from him. Many nights after broadcasts he came back to the hotel, loosened his tie, sat on the edge of the bed, and felt a nameless sadness wash over him. He was good at the new job, Fox praised him, fans loved him, but his heart couldn't find the old rhythm. No adrenaline, no pressure, no roar, just the clacking of production keyboards in meeting rooms. And the most painful part, when he smiled on air, he had forgotten how to smile for real. Viewers saw a calm professional Troy Aikman. They didn't see him standing in front of the mirror after the show, removing the microphone from his shirt, and looking at himself. The man America once saw as the symbol of unbreakable will, now just a faded version of the past. Without a team to lead, he was lost. Without games to prepare for, he had no direction. Without the role of quarterback, he had no identity. And in that lostness, loneliness didn't come with crying or complaints. It came in silence, in dinners eaten alone, in mornings waking up with no reason to get out of bed, in moments re-watching old highlights, and realizing the man in the video was far stronger than the man he was now. Everything he had been, the leader, the warrior, the invincible one, vanished the day he hung up his cleats. It took years for Troy to understand that the NFL hadn't just taken his body, it had taken his identity. And in that loss, mental darkness began to wrap around him like a curtain he couldn't lift. But this wasn't the final chapter of his life. What came next would teach him that loss can lead to rebirth, if he had the courage to stare straight into the darkness swallowing him. But the mental darkness Troy carried after leaving the NFL didn't just cling to his career, it crept into the one place that was supposed to be safest: family. His first marriage to Rhonda became painful proof of what famous people face. The stadium lights don't stop at your front door, and the pressure of expectations follows you into every room, every meal, every moment that should be private. When Troy and Rhonda got married, the Cowboys were at their peak and he was still Dallas's untouchable icon. But at the very moment everyone saw a man at his brightest, inside he carried too many things that hadn't healed. Troy entered marriage with a heart already cracked by the physical and mental pain of the NFL. Rhonda entered hoping for stability and happiness they both wanted but didn't know how to hold on to. At first they clicked. Rhonda's smile was one of the few things that could make Troy forget the ringing in his head. Her warmth made him feel human again, not just a hit-taking machine on the field. But over time, an invisible distance grew between them, not from fighting, but from silence. Rhonda once said, Troy was the kindest man she ever knew, but also the hardest to reach. And that was the bitter truth. A quarterback who could read a defense in a split second, who could see gaps in a pass rush, couldn't see the growing gap right inside his own home. And Troy, who had spent his whole life hiding pain, didn't know how to open up. When headaches came, he stayed quiet. When he couldn't sleep, he stayed quiet. When he felt worthless, he stayed quiet. That silence made Rhonda feel excluded from her husband's inner world, a world built from NFL darkness she could never enter. Fame made everything harder. Anywhere they went out to eat, fans' eyes followed every smile Troy gave. Every gesture Rhonda made was scrutinized. When you marry a legend, you don't just share your life with the man, you share it with his public image in front of millions. And sometimes that image is so big it swallows the real person inside. In the end they separated, not from lack of love, but from too many wounds that were never spoken. Divorce felt like the final cut that made Troy feel he was losing, not just his career but his private life too. A reporter asked him, "What makes you saddest?" Troy answered only, "You can win on the field, but that doesn't mean you win at life." The failed marriage made him feel he had failed at the most important role of all, being a regular man. Because for Troy, failure on the field could be fixed next game. Failure in family left a hole that could never be filled. While the public grew used to the polished, smart, calm Troy on Fox, they didn't know that behind the on-air smile was a man coming home to long, silent nights in a house too big for one person, with a heart too tired to find something to lean on. Many years later he met Catherine Kappa Moody, who brought new hope, a slightly opened door to a gentler chapter. When they married, Troy's friends said they had never seen him that happy since retirement. Kappa wasn't just a partner, she was someone who understood he was trying to piece himself back together. There were moments standing next to Kappa when Troy looked like the man the NFL lights had taken forever, gentle, peaceful, loved for the present, not the past. But life, which had never been easy on him, once again made everything fragile. When differences in lifestyle, emotional distance, and invisible pressures returned, their marriage slowly grew tense. And then, like a crack that had been spreading for years, they finally decided to part ways in 2023. For Troy, the second breakup wasn't just loss. It was confirmation that even after leaving the NFL, the shadow of loneliness still followed him, never letting him find the stability he always craved. He had tried, he had loved, but sometimes love alone isn't enough to hold a family together. Looking back, Troy blamed no one. Not Rhonda, not Kappa, not circumstances. He only blamed himself for not knowing how to live softer after so many years of having to live hard on the field. And in a rare interview, when asked about love, he said one sentence that silenced America: "I don't regret anything. I'm just sad that I wasn't good enough to make it last." That wasn't the confession of a legend, that was the heart of an ordinary man, who had been extraordinary on the field but fragile off it. A man with millions of fans, but not always someone to sit beside him on long nights. A man who once stood on the peak of glory, but still had to learn to face the truth. A legend on the field, but still just a lonely man in his own life. After 2 broken marriages, and a career that left more scars than trophies, Troy entered middle age hoping to find the peace the NFL had never given him. But instead of the ease many expect in their 40s and 50s, his body began betraying him in the quietest, cruelest ways. In the early retirement years, the pain came in waves: a stab in the neck, a morning where his back was so stiff he had to lie still a few extra minutes just to breathe. But over time, those separate pains became permanent companions. By age 50, Troy woke up every morning feeling like someone had hammered his spine all night. His back hurt so much he had to turn his whole body slowly, inch by inch. His right shoulder, which had taken hundreds of shots from defensive ends, grew weaker every year until sometimes he had to use his left hand to help lift anything heavy. But the physical was only the tip of the iceberg. What scared Troy most wasn't back pain or a stiff neck. It was the vague signs appearing in his mind, moments when memory slipped through his fingers like sand. There were days he drove to a familiar store and arrived with no idea what he came to buy. Nights he stood at his own front door, patting his pockets before realizing the keys had been in his hand the whole time. Appointments he had confirmed and marked on the calendar that vanished completely from his mind hours before. For a normal person, those are little things. For a former quarterback who took hundreds of shots to the head, they are warnings. There were moments mid-sentence when the next word simply disappeared. Those pauses sent chills down his spine. And then, like a knife to the heart, news stories flooded everywhere about former NFL players diagnosed with CTE, an incurable, irreversible, slow death sentence for brains that had endured too much. Junior So, Dave Duerson, giant names now only mentioned as cautions. Those stories hit Troy like funeral bells ringing in a quiet room. He read articles, listened to podcasts, watched investigations, and every night the question cut deeper. Am I heading down that same road? Sleepless nights became routine. No more stadium noise, no more lights, just the pulse in his head, sometimes pounding harder like a warning bell that collapse was coming. Some nights he sat up, turned on the light, looked in the mirror, and wondered if one day he wouldn't recognize that face anymore. And in that brutal silence, a fear bigger than physical pain rose up. I'm not afraid of hurting. I'm only afraid of slowly losing myself. That wasn't exaggeration. That was the real terror of a man who knew his brain had taken too much damage over his career, and no one could predict when that damage would fully wake up. So Troy began a journey he never thought he'd have to take, learning to save himself. When doctors suggested physical therapy, he said yes. When they recommended yoga for his spine, he tried. When they said meditation could calm emotions and ease nerve stress, he sat down and tried to find his breath through the constant ringing in his right ear. Those therapy sessions weren't about looking younger or stronger or better. They were about survival. In physical therapy, he lay on the mat while specialists adjusted every misaligned vertebra. Every deep press into his locked-up neck muscles made him bite back groans. In yoga class he was the oldest, slowest, most painful student, but the most persistent. He wasn't there for a new passion. He was there to keep his body from falling apart. Meditation was the hardest challenge. How does a man who lived on adrenaline, collisions, pressure, and chaos sit still for 10 minutes without panicking? But he tried. Every session was a small battle where he fought to keep his mind from drifting to terrifying thoughts about the future. But even while controlling his breath, images of Junior So flashed. Images of former players who forgot their own children's names. Images of once powerful men who could no longer tie their shoes. And Troy knew none of them started their lives thinking that would be the ending. Slowly he learned to accept that this body had been destroyed to the point that nothing guaranteed it would stay loyal until the end. Fans see him on Fox strong, calm, articulate. The camera doesn't show him lying down for hours after every flight, because he's exhausted. Doesn't show him writing notes for every little task because he's afraid he'll forget. Doesn't show him standing in the kitchen in the morning trying to remember if he already put coffee in the machine. Doesn't show him rubbing his forehead before going on air because his head feels like it's in a vise. Those things are the truth only the people closest to him know. And even though he still works, still appears, still smiles, the worry inside never completely goes away. But there is something special. The more he faces the fear, the more human, softer, deeper he becomes. If the NFL taught him how to take hits, middle age is teaching him how to listen to his body and mind, even when they only bring bad news. One day he told a friend, "I don't care if tomorrow my back hurts so bad I can't move. I only care that one day I might look at someone I love and not remember who they are." That confession is unforgettable, because it doesn't come from an athlete worried about his career, it comes from a human being terrified of losing his own heart. And so, Troy Aikman's middle age is not a period of decline, it is the phase where he is fighting a new war, fiercer than any Super Bowl, quieter than any interview, more painful than any Arrington or Dolman hit. This is no longer the battle of a quarterback. This is the battle of a man trying to hold on to a fading identity, clinging to the memories that made him who he is, and trying to keep living with the hope that tomorrow he will still be himself. And as his life has proven, Troy Aikman never quits, even when the enemy this time isn't another team, but time and the aftershocks of the very past he lived. And then amid the endless pain, the nights fearing his memory would betray him, the moments when life seemed to consist only of echoes from his NFL past, Troy began to realize that even though time had taken so much, health, marriages, youth, and sometimes memory itself, it had still left him things strong enough to keep him standing. One of those things was his broadcasting career. The irony is that in middle age, when his body could no longer handle the NFL pace, television gave him a new life, not loud like the field, not dangerous like the hits, but it gave him something he had lost long ago, the feeling that he still mattered. In the broadcast booth, leaning on a microphone instead of a helmet, using sharp analysis instead of muscle, Troy was reborn in a gentler way. No one asked him to hurt anymore. No one hit his head anymore. No one demanded he be a superhero. He only had to speak, and surprisingly, many people said his voice helped them understand football better, love the game more. A colleague once said, "Troy doesn't just analyze games, he tells their story, maybe because he had lived every layer of this game: glory, injury, sacrifice. So when he spoke, people could hear his heart in it. But work was only part of it. What healed Troy deeper than any physical therapy session were his two daughters, Jordan and Allie. When they were little, he was so busy he missed dropping them at school, or attending every recital, something he always regretted. But when the NFL left his life, he realized this was his chance to become the kind of father he never had the chance to be before, the kind who listens, who shows up, who laughs with them instead of hiding pain behind tired smiles. He made time to take them to dinner, walk around Dallas, travel together, and most importantly, listen to them. In an interview, when asked what he was most proud of, Troy didn't say Super Bowls or the Hall of Fame. He simply said, "I'm most proud that my two daughters grew up to be kind people," and that's exactly what he tried to pass on to them. No matter how cruel life is, kindness is the only choice that keeps a person standing. His girls are the reason he keeps up with yoga, meditation, therapy regularly. He doesn't just want to live longer, he wants to stay sharp enough to see their futures. He wants to be there for their graduations, their weddings, the important moments he once missed because of the NFL. But what made him a better version of himself in middle age didn't come only from work and family. It came from something pain had quietly taught him: kindness. No longer surrounded by stadium lights, or the pressure to win, Troy found meaning in giving back to the Dallas community, the place that loved him, even when he was no longer the perfect quarterback of old. He got involved in children's charities, supported education projects, funded high school sports events, and actively contributed to funds researching health issues for former players. When he saw kids wearing shoulder pads too big for their small bodies, Troy saw himself all those years ago, a boy who didn't know what the future held, but knew he needed someone to believe in him, and he wanted to be that someone for them. He never made noise about his contributions, no photos, no campaign posts, no need for praise. He just did it, quietly and sincerely, because he understood that sometimes the kindest thing is the thing no one sees. In recent years, when speaking to students and asked how he wants to be remembered, Troy usually pauses, then says in a low but warm voice, "I don't want to be remembered for touchdowns. I want to be remembered for dignity." That sounds simple, but for a man who lived half his life under the scorching lights of the NFL, it's the strongest statement he could make. Because touchdowns fade, titles get forgotten. But dignity, the way you treat others, the way you get up after pain, is what lasts longest. And looking back, even though middle age brought him so many trials, physical pain, mental shadows, loneliness, and love, Troy still holds three priceless gifts: a job that makes him feel valuable, two daughters who make him want to live longer, and a heart matured through tragedy to become kinder. Pain didn't make him bitter. It made him softer. It didn't break him. It made him deeper. And so in middle age, among the scars of the past and the fears of the future, Troy Aikman found something the NFL never gave him: a small but real peace that truly belongs to him. And then as he turned 59, Troy Aikman realized that life was not going to give him a closing chapter filled with bright lights or fireworks like those Super Bowl nights of old. Instead, it gave him something else: endurance through pain, a quiet kind of strength that no championship ring in the world could ever fully represent. Every morning when he wakes up, his body is stiff as if he aged 2 extra decades overnight. His back aches like someone wrapped steel cable around his spine. His knees creak, reminding him of every scramble, every time he was trapped in the pocket. His neck cracks when he tries to turn left, and his heart, not the athlete's heart, but the heart of a man who has carried too much, beats slower in the quiet early hours. It's not the sharp pain of playing days, it's the pain of age mixed with aftermath, low, stubborn, and never gone. A companion he didn't choose, but has had to learn to live with. Yet the strange thing is, even though his body feels 80, his spirit has never been stronger. Even when it hurts, he gets out of bed. Even when he's tired, he goes to the gym, not to prove anything, just to hold on to whatever ability time still allows. His trainer once said that whenever the pain hits, Troy just closes his eyes for a few seconds and whispers, "One more rep," not the roar of a warrior, just the calm self-talk of a man who finally understands that sometimes victory isn't about power, it's about not quitting. He still goes to work, still goes on air, still breaks down games with that familiar low voice that makes millions of Americans feel they're being guided by the very quarterback who once led the Cowboys to 3 championships. But if you look closely, you'll see a subtle change in his eyes, a softening, a quiet behind the smile, as if every sentence has been filtered through long years of private healing. Loneliness is still there, not the loud loneliness of someone who lost everything, the quiet loneliness of a man who once had an army beside him, and now has only himself on long evenings, when the girls are at school, when work ends, when the door closes, he returns to a silent room and thoughts as deep as an abyss. But unlike the years right after retirement, when loneliness was a wound, now it feels more like an unavoidable friend he can sit with. He has learned to sit with it, not fight it, not chase it away. Another thing 59 has brought him is memory. Bright pieces and dark pieces always tangled together. When he watches old Cowboys highlights from the glory days, he feels pride, but instantly afterward comes the echo of hits that made his head spin. Super Bowls weren't just peaks, they were ghosts. When the lights came on, when the music played, when he lifted the trophy, everything was beautiful, but the price was lost memories, chunks of time torn away like pages ripped out. And he has to live forever with both feelings side by side, glory that makes him proud, and the very same glory that hurts the most. At 59 though, Troy no longer runs from it. He has learned to look at it as part of himself, as a chapter that can't be erased from the book of his life. One day he told a friend, "The Super Bowls gave me my career, but the pain gave me my growth." That is the statement of a man who finally understands that life is not measured by wins, but by how we face their cost. He has learned to live slower, no longer charging into work like a storm, no longer forcing himself to prove he's still strong. Every morning he makes coffee, steps out onto the balcony, lets the cold Dallas wind blow in, and just stands there a few minutes, something that seems simple but never existed in his life before. He has learned to cherish every breath, every sunset, every light workout that eases his spine. Pain is still there, fear is still there, but instead of letting them swallow him, he has learned to walk beside them, like 2 people on a long road who bump into each other now and then, but no longer fight. He knows he is no longer the quarterback, no longer the kid who could throw it 60 yards under crushing pressure, no longer the hero of the biggest game of the year. He is no longer the winner, but he is the survivor. Survivor of hundreds of shots to the head, survivor of nights of depression, survivor of 2 broken marriages, survivor of the fear that his memory will betray him, survivor of a life where the blazing stadium lights hid so many cracks inside, and sometimes surviving is worth more than winning. On rare evenings, sitting alone in front of a dark TV screen, legs aching and spine fighting for every breath, Troy puts a hand on his chest and tells himself, "I'm still here, I'm still going." Not proud, not loud, not glorious. Just a gentle reminder that no matter what life takes, he still has the strength to take one more day. And somewhere in that fragile piece, people see a new Troy Aikman, not the legend of the Dallas Cowboys, but the beautiful image of a human being who walked through tragedy without letting it turn him dark. Proof that sometimes the greatest achievement in life is not lifting the Lombardi trophy, but getting out of bed every morning knowing it will hurt, and still choosing to live with whatever dignity remains in your heart. And then as life brought him to the doorstep of 60, Troy Aikman understood that everything he had ever carried on his shoulders, physical pain, lost love, the fear of fading memory, the weight of being an American icon, was never meant to break him, but to teach him one simple yet sacred truth: we are not defined by the times we are knocked down, but by the times we choose to stand back up even when the body is spent. The NFL took so much from him. It took the flexibility of his back, the steadiness of his neck, pieces of his past, and the freedom from the shadow of CTE that follows him every night. But there is one thing it could never take: his dignity. He walked into the NFL as a young warrior, and walked out as a man who deeply understands both the price of glory and the beauty of resilience. Marriages took away his stability, left him with long nights and a heart covered in invisible scars. But those losses could not take the most important thing he has, a kind heart that knows how to love, how to try, how to admit fault, how to stand up after it breaks quietly. Time took the strength from the arms that once threw thousands of perfect passes. It took speed, endurance, the invincible look of youth. But time, for all its cruelty, could not touch his resolve. It could not reach the deepest part of Troy, the part that never steps back, never lets himself quit, even when everything says, "You've reached your limit." And that resolve, not the 3 Super Bowl rings, is the true legacy of Troy Aikman. The rest of his life, with slow yoga sessions, morning back pain, meditation to hold on to his mind, is not a symbol of weakness. It is the symbol of a man fighting to live well, not just to survive. In interviews, when people ask what message he has for America, for the kids who grew up watching him, for the children dreaming of being quarterbacks, Troy just gives a sad smile and says things that sound simple but carry his whole life. Take care of your body. It's the only friend that goes with you to the end. Live fully with your family. No touchdown can heal a lonely heart. And be grateful to the people who bled for the sport you love. Every score has a price. His words aren't calls to action. They aren't lectures. They are just lessons paid for in bone, in flesh, in memory, in the dark places only former NFL players truly know. And then on some quiet afternoon, no cameras, no crowd, no roar, you might see Troy Aikman sitting alone in the stands of an empty stadium. The weather is mild, a light breeze blows. The white yard lines are still there, peaceful as if they never witnessed brutal wars. He looks down at the green field, where he was knocked down hundreds of times, where he got up hundreds of times, where he won, lost, hurt, felt pride, lost part of himself and found the deepest part of himself. No one knows what he is thinking in that moment. Maybe nostalgia, maybe gratitude, maybe goodbye. But one thing is certain, it is not the image of a long-retired legend. It is the image of a man who has lived a life worth living. A life not perfect, not calm, but rich in courage. And if you listen very closely, you can almost hear him whisper, not to the crowd but to himself. This isn't the story of a quarterback. This is the story of a human being who chose to stand up even when no one thought he could stand up anymore. And perhaps that is the most beautiful legacy Troy Aikman leaves America. When you look back at Troy Aikman's story, it's hard not to feel a deep ache for a man who paid with almost his entire body so America could have explosive Sunday nights. From the picture of a 6-month-old baby with legs in casts, doctors saying this boy may never play sports, to the OU kid, sitting alone in a dorm room, gently tapping a swollen ankle, and wondering if the dream still mattered, we see his journey was always a negotiation with pain. Entering the NFL as the #1 pick, only to be thrown onto a 1-15 team, lying motionless on the Metrodome turf after Chris Dolman, showering in hot water while tears mixed with the spray. That wasn't just athletic tragedy, it was a human being slowly ground down. The glory years with the triplets and 3 Super Bowl rings were built on pain-killing shots as ritual, on concussions that made him ask, did we win or lose? On LeVar Arrington's hit that forced a doctor to warn one more, and you may never speak normally again. Leaving the NFL he was lost, 2 marriages cracked, middle-aged nights terrified by CTE headlines and forgetting keys that were already in his hand. But right there we see the most admirable part, the man never turned bitter. He chose to become kinder, to broadcast with integrity, to give time to his 2 daughters and the Dallas community, to do yoga and meditation not to look good, but to keep showing up fully. At 59, with the body of an 80-year-old yet still working, still training, still smiling, Troy reminds America, take care of your body before it's too late, love your family before fame steals you from them, and be grateful to those who bled so the games you watch are more than entertainment. They are sweat, tears, and the memories of human beings brave enough to stand up when everyone thought they were finished. If Troy Aikman's story of resilience and dignity touched you, please hit subscribe to keep walking with us on other deeply human journeys. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video where we continue to honor the people who rose from their own pain.